And we are good to go. All right, so today what we're going to do is continue on with our discussion about altruism and cooperation. As we've seen in the past couple of lectures, we have multiple pathways through which altruism can evolve. The first we covered 2 lectures ago, which was kin selection, which is where adaptations for altruism can arise when they benefit copies of common genes that are found in other bodies. Because genes are what's getting reproduced in this evolutionary process, the matter of which body those genes are getting reproduced in is kind of irrelevant from the perspective of evolution. Adaptations that help common genes in other bodies reproduce can arise so long as the costs to helping them are lower than the benefits, or rather, they're higher than the benefits. The costs are lower than the benefits, I had that right. As long as the costs are lower than the benefits, discounted by the degree of relatedness between the 2 organisms. So if you share 100% of your genes in common with another organism, you're a bacteria and you reproduce asexually, you just divide in half. 100% of your genes are in both sister offspring. The costs to helping simply need to be lower than the benefits for adaptations for altruism to evolve. Whereas if you're a human and you share 50% of your genes with your offspring, then the costs of helping need to be at least twice as low as the benefits. And then this continues on through other degrees of relatedness. If you're 25% related, the costs need to be 4 times lower than the benefits, and so on. And last time we saw how altruism can also evolve between non-relatives in the form of what we called reciprocal altruism. So in this case, cooperators can deliver benefits to each other, separated by some time lag, with the net result being that both of the cooperators end up being better off. And we saw one example of this in non-human species, where you have 2 different species of fish. You have a cleaner fish and you have a host fish. And the cleaner fish will swim around the host fish and pick off parasites. They'll even swim into the host fish gills or mouth to pick out parasites, and the host fish refrains from eating them and signals when it's going to leave and seeks out the cleaners, and both suffer some risks and costs and benefits, but the result is that both cleaner and host end up better off. And as long as you're exchanging benefits like this, you can get reciprocal altruism to evolve even between species. And we have plenty of examples from our personal lives as humans as for different types of reciprocal altruism we've engaged in. Like if you show up to your job and you get paid, you would rather not go into your job. You are suffering costs and time and risk to go into your job, but you get money out of it. And your employer would rather not pay you, but the benefit they get is work is completed and both parties end up better off. Same if you go out to a restaurant. The restaurant gives you food, you give the restaurant money, both parties end up being better off, even though they're suffering proximate costs. But because both are receiving benefits that outweigh these costs, usually end up better off than if this exchange wasn't possible. But the major threat to these reciprocally altruistic relationships is that they are under a constant threat of cheating, which is where one partner takes the benefits from the cooperative relationship but fails to reciprocate them in the future. And we saw how this can be formalized in the prisoner's dilemma payoff structure, where you have 2 prisoners that are being separately interrogated by the police. Both are incentivized to confess and rat out the other partner. But if they both cooperate and stay silent, they can end up both better off than if both confess. Because both are incentivized to cheat to get an immediately lower reduced prison sentence. But if they both cheat and they both confess, they would have been better off if neither one confessed. And therein lies the dilemma. And we saw that a successful solution to the prisoner's dilemma can arise as long as these interactions are repeated, reputations exist, and then that allows you to enact some type of tit-for-tat strategy where you cooperate with other cooperators and don't cooperate with people who don't cooperate with you. And then as long as you have these repeated interactions occurring with reputations, you can end up in a world where cheaters suffer more costs than cooperators, and cooperation can spread throughout the species as an adaptation. And where we left off last time was the matter of altruism, which is not particularly well explained by reciprocal altruism, such as when a person is donating to charity and they have no expectation that the charity is going to repay them or provide them with a benefit at different times. Or someone gives money to a homeless person and they're not expecting that the homeless person is going to repay them. While we're not trying to explain charity per se, because giving to charities is a relatively novel behavior from our species, what we are trying to explain is the psychological mechanisms that exist and appear to generate these types of behaviors. What psychological mechanisms are responsible for people wanting to donate to charity? That's what we're trying to explain, not so much the specific proximate behavior, but the psychological mechanism that generates it. Because the recipients of this altruism, they aren't genetically related kin, so the kin selection explanation doesn't work, and the recipients are not expected to repay their debts. So the reciprocal altruism explanation doesn't really work either. And so what we're trying to do is figure out why you would see any type of altruism in these types of charity relationships. So in the interests of explaining charity and its associated psychological mechanisms and what their ultimate evolutionary functions are, I want to start by considering another behavior, which at first might seem unrelated to charity. In fact, it might seem antithetical to charity. But I think there are some very common theoretical threads that run between these two behaviors to help explain all of them. And what I'm referring to here is another curious fact of human purchasing behavior, the way we spend our money. Our frequently observed desires to purchase excessively expensive items like cars or clothes. And this comes in a near endless number of forms. People might buy an otherwise normal pair of jeans that retails for hundreds, if not thousands of dollars at times. They could buy luxury cars that sometimes cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Sprawling mansions, expensive wedding dresses. People will spend thousands of dollars on a wedding dress that they intend to wear precisely once for part of a day. Jewelry made of precious metals that does little in the way of any type of function. Expensive watches that are no better at telling time than the cell phone that everyone's carrying in their pocket these days. Spending on these items, these luxury items, hence the term luxury, is not typically functional in nature. The objective quality of the clothing or the watches or the cars do not really account well for their price point or their desirability. People aren't buying expensive watches because they tell time so much better than a phone or a cheaper watch. Much like charity, this behavior of purchasing luxury goods, what we call conspicuous consumption in the economic literature, this also requires an explanation. Why are so many people willing to effectively give up large amount of resources that they have to receive few, if any, additional benefits? Why is someone going to spend $500 on a designer pair of jeans when they can get a $20 pair of jeans that serves the exact same function in terms of their everyday life? And one ultimate explanation for the cognitive mechanisms that generate both of these behaviors, charity behaviors and conspicuous consumption, returns to what we mentioned at the beginning of this lecture concerning what gets reproduced in an evolutionary process. As we've discussed several times throughout many past lectures, the thing getting reproduced in an evolutionary process are your genes, patterns of information. And this is true regardless of what genes those bodies are in, helping to explain our investment in family. And further, as we saw when we were exploring the very foundations of evolutionary theory, not all copies of genes are as good at reproducing themselves as others. The variants of genetics that are better suited for their own propagation, that reproduce themselves more, become more prevalent in future generations, while those that are worse suited to reproduce themselves become less common in future generations. And therein lies a very interesting dilemma for any species that reproduces sexually. Humans are a great example. Some of your genes are going to be combined with the genes of your reproductive partners, and they're going to go into your offspring. If you want to ensure the best reproductive prospects for your genes, for your offspring and future generations, ideally what you want to do is seek out partners who, in a manner of speaking, have the best genes, the highest genetic quality. For example, if being tall leads to better reproductive success than being short, you're better off combining your genes with the genes of a taller partner. Because if you combine your genes with a shorter partner, you're very likely to produce shorter offspring, and these offspring are less likely to be adaptively suited to reproduce themselves in the future. And you're worse off than if you're combining your genes into offspring with a partner that has genes that make them taller. So the height of a partner then can affect your decision about who to mate with and the reproductive success of your offspring. And the same is really true of any trait, not just height. How well somebody's liver functions, how strong someone's immune system is, how well can they fight off bacteria and viruses, how quick are they to learn important information, how successfully can they navigate a social world, how good are they at acquiring resources, and so on. So long as these genetic traits are affecting reproductive potential, we do better to preferentially seek out partners that have the genes that make these adaptive outcomes more likely. Being better at navigating the social world, being better at acquiring resources, being taller, whatever it is that contributes to reproductive success, we should be seeking out partners that have the genes that contribute to those traits. And therein lies a problem. You actually cannot directly assess the quality of your partner's genes. You cannot directly assess the things that are actually going to get reproduced. You don't know the quality of your partner's genes. You want the best genes available for your offspring, but you don't know who has the best genes. So how are you supposed to get the highest quality genetic material from a partner and make the most adaptive mating decisions? The answer here is that we can assess these things indirectly. In some cases, this is going to be a relatively straightforward task. If being tall is adaptive, a good indication of which organisms have genes that contribute to being tall are those who are currently tall. Perhaps that's because they have genes that directly alter developmental programs, encouraging the offspring to grow taller. Perhaps they had genes that made them better at acquiring food relative to others, so they had more adequate nutrition, which allowed them to grow taller. Perhaps they have genes that have better immune systems that allow them to fight off bacteria and viruses more effectively, so they don't waste a lot of metabolic resources getting infected, getting harmed by these outside agents, and this allows them to grow taller. Perhaps all these things are true, and that's what contributes to them being taller. The specific nature of why that person is taller is kind of beside the point. The important part is that all else being equal, as long as your prospective partners differ in height, a good indication as to whether your offspring are going to be tall would be the height of their parents, your height and the height of your partner. So if you want to contribute to having a successful offspring, you would be more well-suited to pick a tall partner relative to a short one. Now, height's a pretty easy thing to assess. You can do that off a simple visual cue. But what happens if you want to assess other aspects of your partner's genetic qualities that aren't as readily available? Again, the same trick can be used. You want to find people that show evidence of having the traits you would prefer your offspring to have. But now you have to do this in a more roundabout way. Since we're talking about charity and conspicuous consumption here, these broadly deal with resources, so let's think about resource acquisition. The trait of resource acquisition. How good is the genetic quality of a partner at acquiring resources? Because having access to abundant resources may prove to be adaptive, allows organisms to survive during times of famine, Having more resources allows them to better weather the harms of the elements of the natural world, be able to protect and provide for their own offspring in turn. It's better to have more resources than fewer resources if you want to survive and reproduce and be successful. And if the ability to acquire resources, however acquiring resources is accomplished, is adaptive, we might expect that, all else being equal, people would rather select mates with access to resources instead of selecting mates that don't have access to resources. Just as they might select taller individuals than shorter ones. If having resources is adaptive, and some genes contribute to the success of resource acquisition, pick mates who appear good at acquiring resources. This gets you the best genes to go into your offspring. Similarly, if being tall contributes to reproductive success, pick tall mates, because these are likely to produce tall offspring. It's an indirect way of assessing the genetic quality of your partners. 1 second. All right, we're back. So, how does one assess a person's ability to acquire resources? Well, a simple way we could do that would be an auditory cue. That is, you're trying to assess the genetic quality of your partners, how good are these genes at acquiring resources, and you want to take the best genes that are good at acquiring resources and put those into your offspring. So how do you figure out who has the best resources for acquiring genes? For acquiring resources. Best genes for acquiring resources. You could use an auditory cue for this. That is, I could just tell you I'm rich. I have $50 billion in my bank account. All of a sudden, this should make me a much more desirable mate to a great many people, because I'm very good at acquiring resources. My offspring are probably going to inherit these positive traits. I can provide for them now. I can provide for you now. This is going to make me seem like a very impressive mate. I just got to tell you. But there's a problem that arises here. Anyone can say they're rich, even if they aren't. If it's adaptive for other people to think that you are rich, that you're good at acquiring resources, there's a massive adaptive incentive to lie about your past, present, and future access to resources. Now, those statements would be a lie, and it would therefore be adaptive for other organisms to ignore what you say, because it's very easy to say it. And you can apply this to a great many domains. It's easy for me to tell you I'll be there for you to take care of you no matter what happens. It's easy for me to tell you that I'm going to pay you back later if you give me something now. It's easy for me to tell you I'm really good at sports. I'm really athletic. It's really easy for me to tell you I'm incredibly smart, that everyone loves me, that I'm honest. It takes me no effort to send those signals. And so those signals don't need to be connected to any kind of truth. If anyone can say those things, why would you trust what people say? What's keeping me honest? In other words, there's a very good reason for the saying, talk is cheap. So how are organisms supposed to solve this problem of separating out cheap talk from credible talk? What keeps these signals honest? And the solution here is for organisms to selectively pay attention to signals that are hard to fake. It's easy for me to tell you I'm a great fighter. It's not as easy for me to actually get in a boxing ring and win a fight. It's especially difficult for me to get into a boxing ring and win a fight if I tie one hand behind my back and I can only fight with that handicap. But as such, if you watch me get into a boxing ring with one hand tied behind my back and I win a fight, this is an incredibly credible, believable signal of my fighting ability. And accordingly, a signal that I may carry a desirable set of genes that you want to see in your offspring. So returning to the matter of charity and conspicuous consumption, I can tell you that I'm rich. but can I show you evidence of obtaining things that other people can't because these things are expensive? If I'm wearing a designer watch that costs $50,000, that shows I had at least $50,000. And if I can wear this $50,000 watch while maintaining an otherwise normal lifestyle, that means I had $50,000 that I could waste on a watch without it seriously impacting my ability to survive. So who's more likely to be actually good at acquiring resources? The person who just tells you they are, the person who is able to purchase a house, or the person who's able to purchase a tremendous house and throw $50,000 away in a designer watch? Just like there's a good reason for the term talk is cheap, there's also good reasons for the saying that actions speak louder than words. And I do want to stress this idea that this money was thrown away on a watch. The money was wasted on a tremendous mansion. As we've noted, these expensive watches aren't particularly better at telling time than the more affordable versions. This means buying a more expensive watch doesn't necessarily give you any benefits. And if I can afford to lose that much money on a watch without gaining any benefits, this sends a much more credible signal of my access to resources than if I was actually benefiting through my purchases by buying something functional. That is, if I purchase a house, and this house has just enough room for me to live in, that sends some signal about my ability to acquire resources, and you can use that to assess my degree of wealth. But if I was to purchase a house that has 50 rooms, and I never even use 40 of them, I'm not getting any benefit from this extra house. This means that my access to resources must have been so great that I can afford to spend them in a frivolous way. If I'm not personally benefiting from my spending, this sends a much more honest signal of my wealth than someone who is spending on things they actually need to survive. If I can waste money in this way, this might signal not only that I have more money right now, but I also anticipate I'm going to continue to have more wealth in the future because I can throw it away in this frivolous fashion. I don't need to save because I have so much stuff and I'm going to keep having so much stuff. What's important here then is the signal value of my behavior. And in evolutionary theory, we refer to this explanation as a costly signaling theory. It is the cost of sending this signal that relates it to credibility. The costlier and more difficult it becomes for me to do something, the more honest that behavior reflects upon certain traits and characteristics that I have. Again, we can return to this idea of fighting. It's cheap, effortless almost, to say that I am a good fighter. It's substantially harder for me to win a fight. However, if I fight against a smaller, weaker opponent and I win, this doesn't send as honest of a signal of my fighting ability than if I fight a stronger opponent that no one else can beat and I win. And it would send a stronger signal still if I can win that more difficult fight with one hand tied behind my back. The costlier the behavior, the greater a handicap I'm working under and still succeeding, the more you can honestly believe I am good as a fighter or good at acquiring resources. As long as I can successfully perform the action, the more I handicap myself, the costlier the action I engage in, the more credible signal I can send other people. But here, caution is warranted if you're the signaler. That is, if you try and send a signal that you're a good fighter and you aren't a good fighter, you're going to end up signaling honestly about your fighting ability, but what you're going to tell other people through your actions is that you're a bad fighter and perhaps a worse reproductive partner relative to others. In a manner of speaking, getting your ass kicked in a fight doesn't tell other people you're a good fighter. If anything, it sends the opposite message. And this is where the signalers need to be careful. Buying that expensive watch might not work out as a credible signal of wealth if you don't have the money, because then you're going to go into debt, you're going to lose your house, and you can no longer credibly signal the wealth that you don't have. You can't spend $50,000 on a watch if it's all the money you have and you need to spend that money on other stuff. The entire point here is that these signals need to be hard to fake. Being hard to fake is what keeps them honest. But that doesn't mean people they're not going to try to fake them. This just creates an evolutionary arms race, where a signaler is trying to exaggerate their own positive qualities, effectively through lying as much as they can, while those observing the signal become less trusting and more discerning. They require even higher bars to be cleared. So if I want to signal my wealth, I might start out by just buying a $100 baseball card. But then if that's successful, other people might find ways to copy that by buying a cheap card that looks similar. So now I have to spend an even greater amount of money to buy something that's harder to acquire, something that's harder to fake. And they'll try and fake it as well and keep up with you. And the people who are observing this are consistently raising their bars for how much the partner has to signal to keep this signal honest. And we see this in both humans and non-humans. Signaling is incredibly common for many species, as they all have qualities they're trying to signal to others, prospective mates or otherwise, and these traits cannot be readily assessed. The textbook example of signaling here is a peacock. In many species, or rather, not many species, in this species, the males develop long and elaborate trains of colorful patterned tail feathers that you can see here. And these feathers posed quite a puzzle for evolutionary theory, because the feathers here seem bad for their survival prospects.
Just because you are authentic and are teaching good values. Smiley face.
So these tail feathers here are bad for the survival prospect of the bird. They're expensive to develop on a metabolic level. They are cumbersome for daily life. And they make it harder for these birds to navigate the world, avoid detection by predators, or escape them if they are detected. And they require some amount of maintenance to remain in good condition. And to understand how annoying these feathers can be for the purpose of a bird, imagine this is a bit like you're going on a camping trip, and you're going to be wearing a wedding dress the entire time you're on a camping trip. This long, cumbersome dress is going to get dirty, it's going to get ripped, it's going to get caught on any number of objects throughout the world, you're going to trip on it, it's generally just going to be a pain in your ass. And this is how the birds are living all the time. And we know these feathers aren't particularly useful for the bird in everyday life for another very simple reason. The females of the species that you can see here don't develop these same tail feathers. The females, rather than being brightly colored, appear more drab in comparison, perhaps owing to the camouflage advantages that being colored like your environment can offer, makes you harder to be detected by predators. And if having these tail feathers was actually good for the survival prospects of the bird, we should expect that the females develop them as well as the males. They don't. And we can also consider how these tail feathers are used. They aren't used to try and frighten away predators. The tail feathers aren't used to locate food. They don't seem related to overcoming any challenges of life. In fact, the tail feathers themselves are a challenge of life. They make it more difficult to do things. Rather, the way the males use these feathers is that they display them selectively. The males will fan their feathers out and display them preferentially to other females of the species, as an incentive to mate. And why would the females want to mate with these males that have these large, elaborate tail feathers? After all, if a male has these feathers, and these feathers are bad for survival, well, if you mate with that male, you're going to put those feathers into your male offspring, and this should be bad for the survival of your male offspring too. So why would females be selecting males on the basis of these tail feathers? And the answer here again appears to reside in this idea of credible signaling. It's precisely because these tail feathers are so costly for the birds that A male peacock with a well-groomed, elaborate set of tail feathers must have been able to survive and thrive in life despite this heavy handicap. Only a bird in very good physical condition is capable of this feat. So as such, if females are preferentially selecting their partners on the basis of these tail feathers, they can be more assured of the genetic quality that they are putting into their offspring. Because birds with lower quality genes in worse condition because of that would be unable to shoulder this immense burden of these tails. And over time, as females start selecting males for this trait, the tail feathers become longer and more elaborate, because this demonstrates genetic quality above and beyond those who already have fairly elaborate tails. Well, mine's even bigger, mine's even longer, mine's even in better condition. And so I'm even superior to the other birds that already have high genetic quality. There's a race to make these ornaments costlier and larger over time as females become more discerning of mate quality. And there's a term for this. When these traits arise due to the mating preferences of a species, rather than because they improve the survival prospects of the animal, we refer to this as sexual selection. So whenever you see these elaborate, colorful, costly displays in a species, these are often the result of sexual selection, whereby one sex is going to preferentially mate with those who display the desired trait and avoid mating with those who don't. And signaling can be used for more than demonstrating the quality of your genes to prospective partners. And one example of this is the common house cat that we see here. Highlights this example pretty well. What you see here is a cat putting on a threat display for another organism. It could be another cat, it could be another animal, it doesn't matter. This cat is trying to threaten something. And what they're trying to do is send a signal to avoid a fight. Because fights are costly, you can get hurt in a fight even if you win the fight. And you'd certainly get hurt in the fight if you lose the fight. It's usually in an organism's best interest to avoid fighting when possible. And one way to avoid a fight is to signal to the opponent that you are likely to win and or that you are likely to cause them harm if they continue to provoke you. And so they back off to avoid the costs you would inflict on them. This allows you to resolve the fight in your favor without actually having to go through the costs that you might suffer during the fight. And so one way animals may do this, as our cat does here, is to adopt behaviors that signal your threat. And this could include vocalizations, like when the cat starts hissing and growling and screaming. It can involve behavioral postures, lowering of the ears, baring teeth and claws to demonstrate your weaponry and your aggressive tendencies. All of these signals here are saying, I'm dangerous, and if you approach me, I'm going to inflict harm on you. You are trying to credibly signal this to other animals. And if your signal convinces your prospective opponent of your danger, they may back off. And this allows you to reap the benefits of winning the fight while avoiding the costs of engaging the fight in the first place. However, the cat here is also doing something else that's worth paying attention to. The cat is arching its back, and the cat is puffing out its fur. Why is the cat doing this? A likely explanation is the cat is trying to make itself appear physically larger than it actually is. Because an animal's physical size is credibly related to its ability to inflict physical harms, to win a fight. The larger the animal, the more likely it is to win a fight relative to a smaller animal. And so what this cat is attempting to do is send a fake signal of its size. By arching its back and puffing out its hair, it's trying to make itself appear larger and more threatening. It's trying to send a fake signal. It's trying to convince another organism of something that's not entirely true. I am larger, even if the cat actually isn't. And as this is a very common behavior among cats, and indeed many other species, making themselves appear larger during confrontations, it's likely that trying to fake or enhance this signal about physical size, lie about it effectively, worked well enough to become ingrained in the development of these species. Cats will do this without learning they have to do this. By piggybacking on a credible signal, physical size, individuals are sometimes trying to fake this signal or enhance it further and reap its benefits, even if they cannot accurately back it up or pay its costs. So with this in mind now, it becomes a bit easier to think about why people may engage in charitable behavior, or why they may purchase luxury clothes, homes, cars, or other goods. What they're trying to do is signal a harder, hidden quality, a quality that's harder to assess, that's hidden from view to other people. So if we're talking about purchasing luxury goods, this can serve as a credible signal of one's current and future access to resources, along with one's quality of whatever physical and cognitive mechanisms led them to be in a position where they can afford to suffer such a heavy cost in the first place, without incurring any serious damage to their ability to survive. Just like our peacocks did. People can afford to buy these because they're so well off because of whatever hidden qualities they have that make them this way. In the case of altruism, people could be trying to signal those qualities as well, but that's not all they might be signaling. They might be signaling through their donations, through their charitable actions, that they are empathetic, that they are cooperative, that they are kind. These traits might be valued in social partners, and so those who behave altruistically may make themselves more desirable as a cooperative partner to others. They could deepen existing cooperative relationships, and sometimes they can even forge new cooperative relationships. They could be trusted by other people to a greater degree, they could hold higher social status, and so on. By donating to charity, they could be signaling positive qualities about themselves that allow them to reap a great number of possible benefits in future interactions. And these benefits can be reaped directly and indirectly. So in the direct case, altruism and kindness towards a stranger or even an enemy could turn that stranger or enemy into a valuable social alliance that didn't exist before. In the event the person that you're behaving charitably to ends up behaving differently towards you in the future. But there's also an indirect route for this, where because other people observe you behaving charitably towards others, this can send a believable signal about your personal qualities, your kindness, your caring, your cooperative nature. Other people can observe those, and even if you didn't benefit them directly, if they know you have those traits, they might be more willing to cooperate with you in the future. And you can think about altruism in this sense as part of a reputation management strategy. So to put this into a very simple and concrete example, if you have to trust someone to take care of an important task for you, you want them to watch your house while you're on vacation. All else being equal, would you prefer to trust someone with a reputation for donating to charity, for being caring, for being loyal, for being empathetic? Or would you rather trust someone that has a reputation of only looking out for themselves and not caring about anyone else? As I suspect many people would prefer the former partner to watch their house, if you can create these positive reputations through people observing how you behave towards others, it can favor the development of cognitive adaptations for signaling these traits via altruistic behaviors. By donating to charity, you can show other people how genuinely interested you are in the welfare of others. Now, do people actually show evidence of this pattern of behavior? It seems they do. At least in one 2009 paper entitled Altruism Towards Strangers in Need, Costly Signaling in an Industrial Society, they tested some predictions of this idea. And the study went like this. They had 180 med students, and these med students were presented with the opportunity to engage in altruistic charitable behaviors. Now, these students were somewhat familiar with each other. They were in the same med classes. but they weren't really stable friends. This was taking place originally during the beginning of this semester. And these students were asked early on in this semester to complete a social recognition task, where you're basically asking questions about, of the people in your class, who do you think you might be friends with? Who do you think you might trust? And so on. To nominate a couple people that they might be friends with, that they might trust, even if they're not terribly familiar with these people yet. So that's the start of the semester. They get this social recognition task done. A few weeks later, a representative from a charity organization would visit these classes to see if the students are interested in assisting on charitable work. And this charitable work includes a variety of different tasks they could volunteer for. You could take blood pressure. You could organize a day for blood donations. You can collect the blood donations yourself. You can care for elderly people. You can provide care for physically disabled people. You could provide assistance for the homeless, or you could provide care for mentally handicapped children. So they had 7 different opportunities for charitable behaviors. And the students could indicate which of these 7 they were interested in performing. And each of these activities, they said it would take about the same amount of time, about 3 to 4 hours to complete any of these tasks. And they would only be engaging in this charity once. So do you want to spend 3 to 4 hours taking blood pressure? Do you want to spend 3 to 4 hours caring for homeless people? And so on. Now, the real key difference in this study here is that in one of these groups, their interest in charity work was reported publicly. That is, they would tell other people in the class publicly which charity acts they wanted to perform. And the other group, people indicated this privately. They would just mark it down on a piece of paper, and no one would know what they selected. At least no one could see what they selected in the moment. And then after the charity task was complete, the students created the same social recognition task they had done earlier. Who are you likely to trust? Who do you want to be friends with? And so on. And what they also did in an unrelated group of 30 people is they showed them these 7 types of charity: taking blood pressure, organizing a blood drive, drawing blood, caring for the homeless, etc. They gave them this list of 7 charitable behaviors, and they asked these people to indicate how difficult they thought they would be to complete, how much time and energy it would take to take blood pressure versus care for the homeless, etc. So you have a measure of how difficult these charity tasks are. We can see the results here for the patterns of altruism these med students were displaying. First, as we can see up top, when the charity offers were made publicly, that is, when you're going to stand up and tell other people what charity you want to do, about 53% of the med students expressed a willingness to help. When the charity was private, about 31% expressed any interest in helping. So when you're making these charities public, when you're making your charitable behaviors public, there was about 20% more people that volunteered to do anything. Now, granted, if you actually went through with these charitable behaviors, it wouldn't be truly anonymous because people would actually see you behaving in the charitable behaviors. So this isn't a perfect test of anonymity, but it does show when people will know about what charitable acts you're going to do, people seem to be more interested in behaving charitably. When the charity can lead to a reputation for you being developed, people are more likely to do it. And importantly, the costliness of engaging in this charity mattered. So when people were publicly talking about what charity they wanted to do, they tended to select the costlier charities. That is, caring for elderly people, taking care of the homeless, taking care of mentally disabled children. When people were expressing what interests in charity they had privately, they tended to select the less costly options, taking blood pressure, organizing a blood drive, things that were viewed as easier to accomplish. So when people are expressing publicly, they're picking more costly forms of charity. When they're expressing it privately, they are picking less costly forms of charity. And when they're expressing it publicly, they're more charitable relative to when it's private. And as we can see in the bottom here, when those people expressed their interests in behaving charitably publicly, they appeared to gain in social recognition. Altruistic individuals had an enhancement of their reputation. But when people were charitable privately, there was no gain in their reputation. So it does seem that people are actually behaving in this way. They're willing to take on more costs when the reputation gains of charity are higher. And with these findings in mind now, we can get a better grasp on some additional forms of altruistic behavior. Those who are behaving altruistically by taking care of homeless people, mentally handicapped children in the last study, they're not really expecting any repayment from the homeless people or the mentally handicapped children. However, it still appears there are other ways they can get benefits from helping those individuals, even if these are indirect benefits. Because through costly acts of helping others, people appear to be able to credibly signal their hidden traits. And this improves their reputation, and this makes other people more willing to hold them in high esteem, to trust them, to cooperate them, and this allows them to reap benefits in other cooperative relationships. And so for those reasons, it appears more common that these proximately altruistic behaviors are going to be undertaken publicly rather than privately to gain the reputation benefits. And this actually leads us to a very interesting dynamic to consider. A lot of people will understand intuitively, even if not necessarily consciously, though some will understand consciously, that people sometimes engage in charitable behaviors not because they care about the people they're helping, but because they're trying to reap the benefits of that reputation gain. And so therefore, this leads to something very interesting when it comes to anonymous altruistic acts. That is, someone who donates to a charity anonymously. Now, why would they do this? Because if you're donating anonymously, there are fewer benefits to be gained. You're not gaining as much in your reputation if no one sees you doing it. But someone who is seen as donating to charity for explicit reputational gain is probably likely to be viewed as less caring than someone who donates anonymously. That is, it's costlier to donate anonymously because you reap fewer gains in terms of reputational benefits. This makes anonymous donations a more honest, credible signal than public donations, than public altruism. So in that sense, the anonymous donations are more altruistic than the public ones and a more credible signal, but you have to trade this off because you're also getting less of a reputation gain. So if someone's going to donate anonymously, the odds, I think, are good they're not truly donating anonymously. That is, some people that work with charities will mention offhand they know many anonymous donors. Usually people that donate anonymously will let some people know about this donation. It'll be visible to some people, but not most of them. And so perhaps what we're seeing there is they're trying to signal to a very select group of people rather than more generally about their qualities. If I'm donating anonymously, where 99% of people don't know that I'm donating, but the 1% of people do know, that 1% of people get a very credible signal of my altruistic tendencies, and they might be more likely to trust me. And if I'm targeting that 1% to gain in reputation, I can send the more credible signal with an anonymous donation. Whereas if someone gets into some hot water socially, and then they start doing charity work, a lot of people can probably sniff out that this charity work doesn't necessarily signal an interest in the well-being of others. It could just be very explicit reputation management, and they would disregard that charitable action as signaling something positive. Now, there's still one other type of altruistic relationship that we haven't quite discussed yet. I want to make a quick note of it now. We're not going to get into it immediately, but these are the friendship or romantic relationships. There's a lot of altruism that happens in romantic relationships, and there's a lot of altruism that happens in friendships. And these appear to be different than kin relationships because you're not related. They tend to be different than reciprocally altruistic ones, and they tend to be different than charitable ones too. While there's unquestionably a lot of reciprocation, for instance, between friends, where they do favors for each other and they help each other out, it actually feels very unpleasant if you have a friend that insists on reciprocating your help immediately. That is, if you go out to a restaurant and you eat, you're expected to reciprocate the help to the restaurant immediately after you finish your meal. They give you altruism, they give you food, you're supposed to immediately pay them back when you're done eating. Friendships work a lot differently than this. If you helped your friend move and they insisted on paying you back immediately, this actually can make them seem like less of a good friend. And so in that respect, friendships and romantic relationships, which do show similar patterns, are different than other types of relationships. We're not going to get into explaining those right now because I have other ways I want to explain them. I just want to note now that we're going to get to them later, and we haven't fully covered the realm of altruism yet. But what I did want to do, when it comes to finishing up today, is talk about signaling with respect to something we all do a lot around here, which is play video games. Humans play games and engage in many different sporting activities. And all these games and sports tend to resemble each other in certain common ways. There's a rule structure that governs how the games are played. There are conditions that define winning and losing the game. And these can be elaborate or simple rules. There can be game pieces or special equipment. It doesn't really matter. They could even involve physical or mental activity, but they all share these two features in common. The rules governing how they are played, and the rules governing what counts as winning and losing. So a question we might ask then is, why do people play games? On a surface level, the answers that people will give you a lot of times is, well, the game's fun. And that's true enough in the proximate sense. Usually people play games because they're fun. But this doesn't explain why the game is fun. All that does is give us an immediate proximate explanation that we now need to further explain on an ultimate level. What makes the game fun and engaging? Why do people enjoy playing them? What makes them fun? Why do people enjoy watching them? That's another very interesting question. Why are these games so engaging to many people? And also, very relatedly, why are games not always so fun? Frustration, anger, disappointment, sadness. A lot of people who are playing games appear to also experience those emotions when they're playing them too. So why are games sometimes not fun? So clearly we have to dig a little bit deeper here. If you want to explain why games are fun, we need to explain why they're fun and why they're not fun. It's not enough just to say, I play a game because it's fun and think you've understand the behavior. And there's a real good reason to interpret gaming under this signaling theory that we've been discussing today. That is, there are a great many physical and mental traits people possess that they want to signal to others. Your speed, your strength, your creativity, your intelligence, your social cunning, your persistence, your dedication, your capacity for planning, the strength of your long and short-term memory, all these different traits. None of these are visible to the naked eye. You can't just look at someone and say, oh, they have a really good long-term memory. And so, as is the case with many other species when it comes to sexual selection, we want to not only signal that we possess these traits, but that we possess more of these traits than other people in the world. That is, not only am I smart, I'm smarter than my prospective competition. You should like me more. I'm not just fast, I'm faster than everyone else. And that's why you should like me more. That is, it's not, when it comes to the peacock, it's not important that the peacock has tail feathers. It's important that the tail feathers that they have are larger and of higher quality than its competition. Exact same principle here. So if you want to signal these invisible traits to others, your speed, your strength, your intelligence, your creativity, whatever it is, especially if you want to show off your relative standing compared to other people, games provide a great avenue for doing this. By having a clearly defined set of rules and conditions for determining the winner, you create a context where individuals are able to display, in an objective, observable sense, the traits they're trying to show off. And the rule set here is vital, and it's why cheating in games is so heavily discouraged. That is, if you're trying to signal your intelligence, you need a special rule set of the game that specifically highlights intelligence rather than, say, physical strength. After all, it doesn't really demonstrate who's the smarter person if your game is defined winning by who can beat the other person up. Similarly, if you're trying to display physical strength, the use of a knife or a gun to win that fight isn't going to credibly signal physical strength at all relative to, say, a boxing match or a weightlifting competition. These games, these sports, these competitions allow us to specifically target traits to signal to others in an objective fashion while ruling out other traits. And also, speaking of weaponry, while we're on the context, games create another very interesting context here, which is a world where you can signal your traits at a reduced risk of injury or physical harm. Much like the cat we saw before that's puffing itself up, that's sending the threat display, trying to avoid the cost of a physical fight, a lot of people want to avoid the costs of competition of fights if they can. But they still want to send signals about who's faster, who's stronger. So we create rule sets in these games to minimize the physical costs, and we have, in many cases, rules against intentionally inflicting physical injuries on other people. Or you might make video games that simulate these competitions rather than people directly engaging in them. That is, it's less costly to play a game of Counter-Strike than it is to give a bunch of people real guns and bombs and find out who's the better team. These games help us signal the things we want to signal objectively while reducing the costs of actually having to engage in these competitions. And this signaling theory helps explain another very interesting facet of games, which is that it tends to be more fun to win them than it does to lose them. That is, in the case of a multiplayer game, it feels better to beat your opponent, and in the case of a single-player game, it feels better to beat a boss or an enemy than to not beat them. If you win the game, or if you beat your opponent, this allows you to credibly signal something about yourself. Whatever traits are required for success, be they speed, intelligence, persistence, whatever it is, you possess them because you were able to win the game. But this is why there's also such a frequent discussion and debate about difficulty in gaming. And it's also why games don't begin and end with a you win screen. People like winning, but they also like difficulty in their games. And there's a very good reason for this. That is, if you want to signal a trait about yourself honestly, the game needs to be challenging. If you have a game that everyone who plays it automatically beats, well, then winning that game isn't going to feel very fun to you. And it's not going to feel very fun to you because everyone can do it. Because everyone can do it, it doesn't send an honest signal about you in particular. It doesn't make you special to win the game that everyone else is winning. So the more difficult the game is, the fewer people can succeed at it. And the people who do succeed at it, the more credible their signal is. By contrast, people who lose at games, that creates another difficult little setting for them. That is, this point about the difficulty, determining the credibility of the signal value of a game, is also very important for understanding why games are frustrating, or depressing, or rage-inducing even. When one is unable to successfully navigate the challenges of a game, or beat their opponent, they are still sending a credible signal, but it's not the signal they want to be sending. Losing at a game, failing to succeed, can credibly signal perhaps that one isn't as smart as other people. One isn't as fast. One isn't as strong. One isn't as creative. Now this, of course, does the person sending the signal no favors. Very few people want to be known by others as not intelligent, as not strong, as not capable. It's going to do damage to your desirability as a mate and a social partner, generally speaking, to fail at overcoming challenges. So how do people tend to respond when a game is too challenging? Or in approximate sense, when it's not fun for them? Well, the simplest and likely most common response is that people just stop playing the game. They abandon it. They leave it to collect dust. And the reason people do this is because rather than repeatedly sending a signal that one is bad at the game, if you just stop sending a signal at all, if you don't play the game, others don't necessarily learn this fact about you. This allows you to avoid reputational and social damage. You might not get the benefits of signaling something positive, but not playing the game allows you to not suffer the costs of signaling something negative. And indeed, savvy game designers know this. And so what they try to do is trick new players by giving them positive experiences of winning early, or they ease them into more difficult challenges by starting with very simple ones and progressively ramping it up. Fortnite's a great example here. In this highly successful multi-person shooter, many first-time players are overjoyed to win their first game, maybe even their first couple games. They just started playing, but they're already displaying a competency, because they're winning, perhaps showcasing their accuracy, their situational awareness, their responsiveness. They're keener in these traits in their competition because they're winning. And these early victories give the players the sense that they are competent, and that as such, because they're sending such a positive signal about themselves, they should keep playing this game more. I'm sending a positive signal about my abilities here. I want to keep playing this game so that lots of people know how good I am. Now, many of these first-time players find out later, if at all, that the first couple of games they were playing were almost exclusively against bots, computer programs that are designed to be bad and designed to lose to the player. Because the competition is so easy, players winning their first game of Fortnite, they're not actually sending a credible signal. It was designed for them to win it. The important part here is that the players don't know this. So the game designers try to trick the players into feeling like they are truly above average performers, that they can send these signals, and this keeps the players playing. Other games are going to do this in a more explicit way. That is, they're going to start you with a tutorial. They start you very simply. They have you overcome very small challenges, have you master very simple tasks early on, only to challenge you more in the future. Because they want to ease you into this. They want to give you this feeling of, I'm winning, I'm winning, I'm winning, so you keep playing. If they threw this at you in the first place, the most challenging fights, the most challenging mechanics, players would fail early and they would probably stop playing to avoid sending the signal, I suck at this. And there are other player versus player games that use these tools too. That's why we have a matchmaking algorithm, where players of similar skill are preferentially matched against each other. This matchmaking algorithm, incredibly valuable tool, because if you took a new player and you threw them into a PvP game against a seasoned veteran, a new player fighting someone who's been playing Counter-Strike for 10 years, or someone who's been a Street Fighter professional for 20 years, the new player is going to lose almost instantly in every case. It's not going to be close. The new player is going to feel that they send a negative signal about their abilities. They're going to get frustrated. They're going to fail to have fun, and they're going to leave. That's why we start with tutorials. That's why we start with fake challenges. But game companies here aren't the only ones trying to cheat, in a manner of speaking, and send these dishonest signals. Players do it all the time too. Now, sometimes this is actually explicit cheating, where people are trying to break the rules of the game in order to make themselves more likely to win it. I did this when I was younger. I remember being young, playing video games, Doom in particular, and I would put in the cheat codes for these games. I would be playing Nintendo, and I would use Game Genie to input cheat codes to the game. I would make myself invincible, give myself the ability to walk through walls, infinite ammunition. These cheat codes provide the experience of winning, But they provide it because it's pretty much impossible to lose the game. And thus, if you win the game while you're cheating, you're not sending a credible signal about your abilities. However, if other people are unaware you are cheating, you can sometimes get the best of both worlds. You can send a signal to other people that they're going to believe about your skills, but you don't actually have to pay the costs associated with having these traits. Even if you're not as smart as your opponent, if you can cheat and still win the game and other people don't learn this, they may think you're smarter than your opponent. This is why cheating is so important for games and why people care so much about it. And also why people engage in it. Might think it's silly, why would someone cheat in a game? It's just a game. But this is why. But cheating isn't the only way people attempt to avoid the costs of sending less than flattering signals about themselves. We can turn to our game, Hearthstone, for a couple quick examples. Many people fancy themselves very smart, creative individuals. Above average, certainly. I'm smarter than most people. I'm more creative than most people. And what better way to send that signal to other people in a way that they'll believe than by building your own decks, utilizing card synergies other people don't see, and you win because of this. You're intelligent, you're creative, good for you. It's a great idea, but the problem is that many deck builders are going to struggle with the part where they actually have to win the games. Because if they lose the games with the decks they've built, that might perhaps mean they're not as smart or creative as they thought they were. Maybe their losing the game means they lack the traits required to be successful. And if other people see them losing, well, now other people know this too. But not so, they'll tell you. You see, they didn't lose the game because they weren't smart or creative enough. They lost the game because their opponent net-decked. That is, their opponent went online and found a deck someone else had made. Because their opponent didn't do the work of actually building and refining the deck that they're playing. Well, if they win with it, that doesn't reflect my opponent's ability to signal these traits successfully. The competition was unfair. My opponent was cheating by copying a deck from someone else. So because they win, but they won because someone else did the work for them, because someone else helped them cheat, this doesn't make the loss for me a bad signal of my intelligence and creativity, just like it doesn't reflect positively on their ability to think creatively. They didn't make the deck, they just stole it. And for this reason, these people often tend to get pretty upset at data aggregation sites, like HS Replay or Vicious Syndicate, because these sites help propagate information. They encourage people to net deck. And these complainers, frankly, do have a bit of a point. That is, if everyone who played Hearthstone was forced to make their own decks, come up with their own ideas free of outside influences, then one's ability to build a deck and succeed in Hearthstone would, in fact, be a more credible signal of people's intelligence and creativity. Now, the problem they run into here is that there's no rule in the game of Hearthstone about having to make your own deck. And this is what makes their claims fall flat. The game doesn't say you need to do this, free of outside influences. But if people had to, it would indeed make it a more credible signal. But net decking is not the only complaint. What if your opponent only won the game because the game itself is imbalanced? That is, the opponent played strategies or cards that are so good that if you are not playing those cards, you're just going to be losing. It's not a level playing field. Again, the complaint here is that the signal value of the game is poor. It doesn't matter how much time I spent practicing my deck and building my deck and refining my deck if my opponent's cards are simply better than mine. That is, it also doesn't matter, say, how good you are as a boxer. If you spend years learning to box and someone else shows up to the boxing match with a gun that they, in 30 seconds, were taught how to use, the person with a gun is going to win that fight most of the time. And because the gun is so simple to use, it's not going to actually let people honestly signal their ability to fight. The match is too lopsided. Similarly, if cards in the game are so overpowered, well, that means they're hampering skill expression. They're getting in the way of being able to send this credible signal, thus making the signal less credible and the game poorly designed. And while you can also argue that nothing in the rules says you're not allowed to put the overpowered cards in your deck and pick the best strategy, again, the complaint actually does have some degree of merit. If there is only one way to succeed in a game, the game is less good at credibly signaling a variety of traits. They're not totally off base. Other complaints as well. You ever hear that someone got unlucky? That is, they were supposed to win the game. They should have won the game. They played it better. They made better choices. They made smarter moves. They made all the correct plays. But the opponent won because they got lucky. Why are people complaining about luck? Well, in this case, the luck factor is seen as degrading skill. The luck, in other words, makes the signal less credible. The loss wasn't the result of somebody's underlying traits. The loss was just the result of random factors. That shouldn't be taken as a strike against me. I didn't lose the game because I did anything wrong. I did everything right. I made the smart plays. But then I was just handed a loss anyway. That loss shouldn't mean I'm not smart. That loss should just mean that I got unlucky. Why is there so much randomness in this game? So even though luck may even out over the long haul, over an infinite number of games, luck may actually explain none of your wins or your losses in terms of your overall percentage, because you're just as likely to get lucky as unlucky. It is something people use to excuse their performance in the short term. But therein really lies a complaint issue, and it's one that's common to all these complaints. The game is imbalanced. People are net decking, whatever. Here's the problem. It's really easy to complain about these things. It's easy to complain the game is poorly designed. It's easy to complain the game is imbalanced. It's easy to complain the opponent got lucky. It's easy to complain that the opponent net decked. It's, in fact, sometimes easy for some people to complain that they think the matchmaking algorithm is actually rigged against them. Whatever the complaint is, it's effortless. And because it is so easy to complain about this game, these complaints are themselves not always credible. These complaints could just be cheap talk. People trying to attempt and explain away their otherwise honestly poor performance. That is, people are complaining because they are honestly sending a signal they're not very good at the game. However, they don't want other people to know this. They themselves might not even know this. And what they're trying to do is get other people to think positively of them despite their performance, despite their losses, despite being stuck at a low rank, despite the fact that they are unable to beat a boss in Dark Souls or Elden Ring. The problem, you see, is that the game is poorly designed, and it's not accurately allowing me to showcase my positive traits. If the game was well designed, well, I'd be able to perform just fine. No, I'm not the problem. Oh, no, it's the game. And that's where a lot of these complaints come from. And these complaints extend to all number of other domains as well. Is this person at the gym really strong and dedicated? Or do they look that way because they're using steroids? Is this person really attractive? Or do they only look good because they're using cosmetics or some type of AI filter? Is this a real person you're talking to online? Or is this a spam bot or an artificial intelligence? People are very, very concerned about these types of things because they make signals less credible, less believable. And understanding and appreciating the deep value of signaling and the way it leads to these arms races between the people that are trying to send signals of themselves that are positive and the receivers that are trying to get accurate information, and how this creates all these dynamics about people trying to cheat the system, it's vital for making sense of a lot of human and non-human behaviors. Now, on a proximate, immediate sense, we may not always be consciously thinking about signaling when we engage in these behaviors. We probably just find a game fun or interesting. But the reason that we find it fun and interesting has to return us back to this ultimate level of analysis, and we think about what function the psychological mechanisms serve that are generating these feelings of this is fun or this is frustrating, and why. And this is where signaling really helps us understand a lot of behavior.